"You are a disgrace." The voice hissed through gritted teeth, right next to my ear, drowning out the ringing that followed the thunderous slap. My cheek was burning, numb. My whole world tilted, and for a second, all I could hear was the frantic thumping of my own heart in my chest. "You won't get a single cent from my will." The man I called father, Robert Twitty, stood before me, his face contorted with rage. I regained my balance and realized that the entire grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel had fallen silent. The music had stopped. The laughter had died. And then, I saw it. Mouths agape in shock, eyes wide open. And as if on cue, dozens of phones were raised, their flashes going off relentlessly, like vultures descending on a feast of carrion. They were recording the most humiliating moment of my life. Through a blur of unshed tears, I looked toward my brother, Kevin. He was standing right behind our father, amidst the whispering crowd. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look worried. There was only a slight smirk on his lips, a silent acknowledgement of a quiet victory. A strength I never knew I possessed suddenly rose from my deepest core. The burning pain on my cheek transformed into a cold, sharp clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I took a deep breath, straightening the spine that had grown accustomed to stooping. I lifted my chin, looking directly into Robert's cold eyes for one final second. Then I turned around. The parade of shame began. I walked off the stage, parting the crowd that moved away from me like water for a ship's bow. I didn't look at anyone. I could just feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on my back, feel the heat of their contempt, their morbid curiosity. I walked straight toward the heavy oak door at the end of the hall, my hands clenched into tight fists. I pushed the door open and threw myself into the arms of the Chicago night. Snowflakes immediately slapped against my face, cold and fierce. They landed on my hair, on my shoulders, trying to extinguish the burning fire on my cheek. But they couldn't. Because that fire wasn't on the outside. It was scorching me from within. The story of truth, betrayal, and my revenge has only just begun. Please like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any details. The faint light of a Chicago winter morning crept through the gap in the curtains, cutting a bleak, gray slash across the cold floor. I had been sitting on the sofa all night, still in the now wrinkled evening gown. The bruise on my cheek had turned a deep purple, throbbing with a dull ache like a physical reminder. The silence in my small apartment was terrifying. It only made the storm in my head and on social media louder. With a kind of cruelty to myself, I opened my phone. The screen lit up with dozens of notifications. My face, contorted in pain, was everywhere. Photoshopped, turned into memes, analyzed by people I had never met. What did she do to make a father do that? One comment read, "She looks pathetic, but she's probably no angel either." Another one judged. Every word was a shard of glass scraping against my skin. I tossed the phone onto the other side of the couch, feeling like I was drowning. They were right. I was pathetic. I was a mistake, a disappointment, just as Robert had said. Just then, the phone rang, the familiar ringtone sounding out of place. An unknown number. Area code 206, Seattle. It had to be a journalist who had dug up my number. I was going to ignore it, but it kept ringing with a steady persistence, as if the person on the other end knew I was there. With a surge of random irritation, I answered. "Who is this?" My voice was harsh and hoarse. "Is this Miss Emily Twitty?" A woman's voice replied. The voice was calm, professional, and strangely cold, not a hint of curiosity or pity. "If this is a journalist looking for a story, you've got the wrong number," I snapped. "No, miss," the woman said, her tone unwavering. "My name is Judith Blackwell. I am a lawyer representing Mr. Magnus McMullen. We're calling regarding a very sensitive matter." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. Sensitive? The whole world just watched me get publicly humiliated. There's nothing sensitive left. We understand, she said, completely unaffected by my bitterness. Mr. McMullen saw the video of you, and he believes that you might be his long-lost daughter, Ethel McMullen. A long silence followed. I tried to process her words. Ethel McMullen. A strange name. This was a cruel joke. It was even more cruel than the comments online. This is the cruelest joke I've ever heard, I whispered, my voice trembling with anger. We understand your skepticism, Judith continued, as if she had anticipated this reaction. That is why we are not asking you to believe anything. We are only proposing a meeting, and if you agree, we would like to conduct a DNA test, completely confidential and free of charge. Mr. McMullen will cover all expenses. Just to confirm or rule out this possibility, you have nothing to lose. I sat up straight. A DNA test. Free of charge. Confidential. The offer was too absurd, yet it was presented with a terrifying logic. They weren't demanding anything. They were just presenting a possibility. I looked around my cheap rented apartment, at my empty life. I had lost my family, my honor, my future. What else was there for me to lose? Even if this was an elaborate scam, it couldn't be any worse than my current reality. The silence on the phone stretched on, but this time, it wasn't awkward. Ms. Blackwell was giving me time. She wasn't pushing. Finally, I took a deep breath. What's the address? Judith Blackwell's office was on the 35th floor of a glass and steel tower overlooking Lake Michigan. Everything was perfectly arranged, dark mahogany, real leather, and not a speck of dust. There were no family photos, no personal decorations. This was a place for solving problems, not for sharing feelings. That cold, professional atmosphere made me feel strangely safe. She didn't ask about the party or about the bruise on my cheek. She just invited me to sit and got straight to the point. As I mentioned on the phone, my client, Mr. Magnus McMullen, believes there is a possibility that you are his daughter who was kidnapped 28 years ago. This is the initial case file. She pushed a thin file towards me. I hesitated, then opened it. A yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Newborn girl mysteriously vanishes from St. Mary's Hospital." There was a blurry photo of a young couple, their faces etched with grief. I looked away, not daring to look too closely. I understand this is a great shock, Judith said, and words are worthless at this moment. Only the truth matters. I nodded, my throat dry. A part of me was screaming that this was a cruel hoax, some elaborate scheme I couldn't comprehend. But another part, a small, desperate part that had been dormant inside me for so many years, clung to it. I agree, I heard myself say. Let's do the test. Ms. Blackwell showed no surprise. She just picked up her phone and spoke a few brief words. 15 minutes later, a woman in a medical uniform entered, carrying a small box. She performed her task quickly and quietly. A long cotton swab swiped the inside of my cheek. A small needle pricked my fingertip. It all took 5 minutes. 5 minutes to redefine a lifetime. The results will be available in 48 hours, the medical technician said before leaving. Those 2 days were not 48 hours. They were an endless void where I was suspended between hope and fear. I couldn't eat. Everything was tasteless. I couldn't sleep. I just lay staring at the ceiling, the image of Robert's slap, and the grieving faces of the couple in the old newspaper photo flashing in my mind. What was more terrifying, to continue living the life of an outcast, or to discover that my whole life was a lie? I returned to Judith's office at the appointed time. This time, the atmosphere seemed heavier. She said nothing, just placed a sealed white envelope on the polished wooden desk, right between us. "The results," she said curtly. She didn't open it. She let me do it. My hands trembled as I took the envelope. It was light as a feather, but it felt as heavy as lead. The sound of the paper tearing was like a roar in the silent room. I pulled out the paper. Numbers, charts, complex genetic terms I didn't understand. I scanned to the bottom, searching for a simple answer, and I found it. I didn't understand the terminology, but I understood the words printed in bold at the very end. Probability of paternity, 999%. The paper slipped from my numb fingers, landing softly on the expensive Persian rug. The world around me seemed to dissolve, the sounds faded away. I was not a Twitty. Robert was not my father. Helen was not my mother. The coldness, the injustice. None of it was my fault. When I looked up, my eyes blurry, Judith was pushing the file towards me again. This time, she had it open to the page with the photo. I forced myself to look closely. The man with the resolute eyes and a deep sadness. And the woman. The woman in the photo had my smile. No, to be more precise, I had her smile. I had her eyes. I had her cheekbones. I was looking at another version of myself, a version that had never known hatred, a version that was loved. The initial shock passed, giving way to something else, a cold realization. The wall I had built around myself for 28 years to protect myself began to crack, and through those cracks, the sharp shards of the past began to shift, rearranging themselves into a picture I had never dared to imagine. The truth didn't hit me like a flood. It seeped into me slowly, coldly, and with a brutal clarity. I didn't recount it to Judith. I just sat there, in her expensive leather chair, and the memories I had tried to bury, to dismiss as normal misfortunes, now resurfaced, illuminated by the horrifying light of the truth. Every punishment, every undeserved tear, now had an explanation. The first memory, the scratch on the car, when I was 15. Robert had only one passion besides money, a silver 1973 Porsche 911 that he was restoring himself. That car was sacred ground. No one was allowed to touch it. One Saturday afternoon, Kevin, who was 9 at the time, snuck into the garage to show off to a friend. He climbed into the driver's seat, wriggled the steering wheel, and in a moment of reckless mischief, used his house key to carve a long, deep gash along the side door. When Robert found out, he roared like a wounded animal. Kevin was so scared his face turned pale, and when Robert turned to him, he burst into tears and pointed to the corner of the garage where my easel and some of my art supplies were. It was Emily, he sobbed. She left her stuff everywhere. I tripped over it and fell into the car. It was a clumsy lie. Absurd. But it was the lie Robert wanted to believe. He didn't ask me a single word. He stormed straight into my room. I was reading a book, and when I looked up, all I saw was the fury in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He walked straight to the corner where my wooden box, which contained my entire world, was. My brushes, my oil paints, my charcoal sticks. It was the only place where I could be myself. He grabbed the box. "No, Dad, don't!" I screamed, rushing forward. He pushed me away so violently that I fell sprawling on the floor. Then he walked out to the balcony, threw open the doors, and turned the box upside down. I watched in horror as my brushes, my colorful paints, fell down to the stone-paved courtyard below, shattering to pieces. "You won't have time for this nonsense anymore," Robert growled, his breath heavy. "From now on, you will spend every weekend cleaning that garage until it shines like a mirror. You will learn to respect other people's property." I didn't cry. I just lay there, on the cold floor, feeling as if my own soul had just been thrown from the third-floor balcony. The second memory, the broken tablet, when I was 17. Kevin got the most expensive tablet for Christmas. 2 weeks later, he dropped it in the pool. The device was completely useless. Knowing he would be scolded, he came up with a plan. He secretly put the broken tablet in my backpack. That evening, Helen called me down to the living room. She was sitting on the sofa, holding the waterlogged tablet. Kevin stood beside her, his eyes welling up with tears. "Can you explain this, Emily?" Helen asked, her voice as cold as ice. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I never touched it." "Then why was it in your bag?" Kevin interjected, his voice full of feigned hurt. "She's jealous because I got new things. She took it and broke it." "You are a liar," Robert said, emerging from his study. "A destructive liar." He strode towards me, and this time, he didn't raise his hand. He snatched my phone, an old model that I had saved my allowance for a whole year to buy. He threw it on the floor and crushed it with his heel. The screen shattered. "You will not be allowed to use a phone or computer for 6 months," he declared. "And as for your college tuition, I will only pay the bare minimum for a public school. You don't deserve nice things." They had cut off my connection to the outside world. They had punished me for a crime I didn't commit, and that punishment had reshaped my entire academic future. I came out of the memories, finding myself still in Judith's office. This time, I didn't cry. Another feeling was rising inside me, a feeling as cold and hard as steel. It was anger. I had always wondered why they treated me that way, why they were so willing to believe the most absurd lies and punish me so cruelly. Now I understood. I was not their daughter. I was their scapegoat. I was the outlet for all their frustrations. I was the trash can for all the mistakes of their precious son. My existence in that house had only one purpose: to protect Kevin's perfection at all costs. And the cost was my life. The flight from Chicago to Seattle felt like a strange dream. For the first time in my life, I wasn't flying for a business trip arranged by Robert, or a forced family vacation where I was always the third wheel. This time, I was flying alone. I looked out the window, watching the city of Chicago shrink beneath a blanket of white clouds. I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was being pulled forward, to a place I had never known, but that my soul seemed to recognize. Magnus McMullen's house was not a cold mansion. It was nestled on the shore of Lake Washington, built of wood and stone, looking cozy and in harmony with nature. The scent of cedar and the damp air after a light rain enveloped me as soon as I got out of the car. It was a world away from the smell of furniture polish and the suffocating atmosphere of the Twitty house. A man was waiting at the door. He was tall, with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair, but his shoulders were slumped by an invisible weight. As I got closer, I saw his eyes. They were my eyes, but they held a deep sadness that stretched across 28 years, a sadness I couldn't possibly comprehend. He said nothing, just stared at me. A minute passed, then 2. The silence wasn't awkward. It was filled with unspoken words, questions, and an undeniable recognition. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice hoarse. My mother's name. My middle name. Tears began to well up in his eyes. He took a step toward me, then another. He hesitantly raised his hand, as if afraid I would vanish. His fingers trembled as they lightly touched the purple bruise on my cheek, where Robert's hand had struck. "What did they do to you?" His voice broke. It wasn't an accusatory question. It was a cry of pain. For the first time in my life, someone saw my pain and shared it. The wall I had built up collapsed. I began to cry, not the silent, shameful tears, but uncontrollable sobs. He pulled me into his arms. His embrace wasn't awkward at all. It was sturdy, safe. I could smell his woolen sweater, the scent of a father. I buried my face in his shoulder and cried for the 28 stolen years, for the lonely nights, for the insults, and for the mother I had never had the chance to meet. We stood like that for a long time. When I finally calmed down, he led me into the house. Inside, a fire was crackling in the fireplace. He handed me a cup of hot tea, its warmth spreading through my cold fingers. How did you find me? I asked, my voice still trembling. Magnus looked at me, a painful irony in his eyes. It was the video, he said. For all these years, all I had were blurry photos of you as a newborn and a sketch of a nurse who had disappeared. The case went cold. But then I saw that video on the news. The world saw a family scandal. They saw humiliation. As for me, he paused, taking a deep breath. I only saw my wife's face. I saw Eleanor in your pain. I knew it was you. Their cruelty was the very thing that led you back home. I was stunned. The most humiliating moment of my life was also my saving grace. My father stood up and went to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room. He opened it with reverence. Inside were dozens of leather-bound journals worn with time. Your mother, he said, his voice full of love. She was a writer. After you were taken, she kept writing. Every day, she wrote to you. He placed a journal in my hands. The leather was soft and cool. I tremblingly opened the first page. My mother's handwriting was elegant, flowing. To Ethel, my beloved daughter. Today is the 37th day you've been away from home. Your father just finished assembling the crib he built with his own hands. It still smells of pine. I've placed your favorite teddy bear inside, so it won't feel lonely. Just like me. I pressed the journal to my chest, fresh tears streaming down my cheeks. But this time, they didn't burn with pain. These were not the tears of humiliation. These were the tears of being found. I stayed in Seattle for a week that passed like a dream, filled with my father's stories about my mother, with the love-soaked pages of her journals, and with the peace of being myself for the first time. But we both knew this was just the calm before the storm. I returned to Chicago. The city was still cold and gray, but this time I no longer cowered before it. I walked with a purpose. My father was with me, his silent presence a steady anchor. We didn't stay in a hotel. We stayed in a penthouse apartment that Judith had arranged, with glass walls overlooking the entire city that had once imprisoned me. While I was rediscovering my past, Judith and her team had been working relentlessly. They had traced the payment of $5,000 from a secondary account of Robert Twitty to an offshore account opened under a false name right after I was born. They had also found the nurse from all those years ago, Carol Pines. She was living under a different name in Arizona, always looking over her shoulder. When the FBI agents found her, she broke down and confessed everything. Everything was ready. To quash the rumors and salvage their image after the infamous video, the Twittys did what they did best. They threw an extravagant event. Not a party, but a press conference disguised as a charity night at their own mansion. That night, my father and I sat in a dark car parked across the street, hidden behind a thicket of bushes. From here, we could clearly see the light pouring from the large windows of the house. I saw the luxury cars pulling up one after another. I saw Robert and Helen standing at the door, greeting guests with perfectly polished smiles, as if nothing had happened. "You don't have to watch this," my father said softly, placing his hand on mine. "I need to," I replied, my eyes fixed on the house. "I need to see it end where it began." At exactly 8 o'clock, as Robert stepped up to a makeshift podium in the garden to give a speech, a convoy of vehicles arrived. They weren't limousines. They were black SUVs with no sirens, gliding silently up the stone-paved driveway. The doors flew open, and figures in jackets with the letters FBI in yellow swarmed out, moving quickly and quietly. The chaos began. I saw the guests startle, the music cut off abruptly. Through the binoculars, I saw Robert's face change from smugness to disbelief, then to sheer panic as two agents walked straight toward him. Helen collapsed, her silk evening gown spreading out on the lawn like an oil slick. Kevin stood frozen, his face pale with fear. As they handcuffed Robert, his shouts of protest echoed through the night, weak and pathetic. As they escorted him away, his eyes swept over the panicked crowd and then, as if drawn by an invisible force, they stopped, locking onto the darkness where our car was parked. I don't know how he could have seen me, but he did. In that moment, I no longer saw contempt or power in his eyes. I only saw a man who had lost everything, buried under the weight of the very lies he had created. And I, the daughter he had cast away, was witnessing it all. I had thought I would feel triumphant. I had thought I would smile, but I didn't. I just felt a strange stillness, as if the noise that had been screaming in my head for 28 years had finally stopped. The federal courtroom had no room for luxury. There was no polished mahogany or crystal chandeliers, only emotionless beige walls, hard wooden benches, and an air thick with the solemnity of the law. For the first time, I saw Robert and Helen Twitty in a place where their money and power had become meaningless. They sat at the defendant's table. Robert, the man who once made me tremble with a single glance, now looked small in his oversized suit, his silver hair disheveled. Helen kept her head bowed, her hands tightly clutching a handkerchief, her body trembling uncontrollably. They were no longer the giants of my memory. They were just two old, frightened people. When it was my turn, I walked to the witness stand. Each footstep on the wooden floor echoed with clarity. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked straight ahead. "Please state your name for the record," the court clerk said in a monotone voice. The entire courtroom fell silent. I could feel the eyes of my father, Magnus, on me from the front row, a silent pillar of support. I took a deep breath, feeling the dry air of the courtroom fill my lungs. I looked directly at the defendant's table. My gaze swept past Helen and stopped on Robert. "My name," I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady in the silence, "is Ethel Eleanor McMullen." A soft murmur rippled through the room. I saw Robert's shoulders flinch. He finally looked up at me, his eyes a chaotic mix of shock, denial, and perhaps a flicker of late-stage regret. "Miss McMullen," the prosecutor began, "can you describe your relationship with the defendants?" I kept my voice calm, devoid of emotion. I was not raised. I was programmed. Surprise flickered across the prosecutor's face, but he quickly regained his professional composure. "Could you explain that further?" "From the age of 6, when their biological son was born, my role was clearly defined. I existed to serve and support the future of Kevin Twitty. Every choice in my life, from my extracurricular classes to my college major, was steered to mold me into a useful tool for my brother." I didn't tell my story with pathos. I presented it like a report. I showed the court the emails from Robert Twitty, assigning me, a sophomore in college, the task of completing Kevin's entire business thesis because he needed to focus on his social connections. I presented the bank statements showing my meager allowance compared to Kevin's unlimited credit card. I didn't look at them. I spoke only to the jury, to the truth. My words were cold, precise, and irrefutable. That very calmness was my most powerful weapon. It showed that I was no longer afraid, no longer their victim. When I finished, the courtroom was utterly silent. I could see the disgust on the faces of the jurors. I could see the complete collapse in Helen's eyes when she finally looked up. As I stepped down from the witness stand and walked past the defendant's table, I didn't look back. I had spoken my truth. The rest, I left to justice. I walked straight to my father, and as he stood up and put his arm around my shoulder, I knew that the most painful chapter of my life had finally closed. 6 months passed. Robert and Helen Twitty were convicted on multiple counts, from federal kidnapping to fraud. Their sentence was life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The empire they built on lies had now crumbled to dust, their assets frozen and liquidated. The press called it the fall of the House of Twitty. But to me, it wasn't a fall. It was a liberation. I sold my apartment in Chicago. I couldn't breathe the air of that city anymore. Every street corner, every skyscraper whispered of the ghost of Emily, the girl I used to be. My father, Magnus, wanted to give me everything. A seat on the board of directors, a massive trust fund, a life without a single worry. But I refused. I need to build something myself, I told him as we were walking by the lake. Something that's mine, something honest. My father looked at me, an understanding smile on his face. He didn't try to persuade me. He just nodded. And I did just that. I stood in the boardroom of the McMullen Corporation. Before me were the board members, powerful men and women accustomed to numbers and profit charts. I didn't talk about profit. On the large screen behind me was the detailed plan for the Eleanor McMullen Art Foundation, a nonprofit organization with the mission to fund talented young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds. I used all the business knowledge Robert had forced me to learn, all the sleepless nights doing Kevin's homework. But this time, I turned it into a tool to create beauty, to bring opportunity. I presented fluently, with precise data and a clear vision. When I finished, there was a silence in the room. I saw surprise, and then respect, in their eyes. They no longer saw me as a lucky heiress. They saw me as a leader. In the afternoon, I was in my own space. Not a boardroom, not a penthouse apartment. It was a small art studio I rented in the suburbs of Seattle, with large windows overlooking a lush green garden. The air was filled with the smell of oil paint and canvas, a scent I once thought I would never breathe again. The warm, late afternoon sun slanted through the room, landing on the unfinished painting on my easel. I wasn't trying to repaint my mother's face from old photographs. Instead, I was painting a sunrise over the sea. Strokes of orange, pink, and gold were fighting against the darkness of the night. A new beginning. Next to the easel was a small table where I kept my mother's journals. I had read them all, dozens of times. Her voice had become a part of me, a whisper of love and strength. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. I just went over the detailed plan for the foundation. You've made your mother very proud, Ethel. A natural, unforced smile appeared on my lips for the first time in years. I put down my brush and took a step back to look at my work. The painting was still unfinished, with many empty spaces, just like my life. They had taken 28 years from me, but they couldn't take who I was. My story didn't begin with a slap in a ballroom, nor did it end with a verdict in a courtroom. It begins right here, in the quiet of this studio, with every stroke of color I choose, with every new day I decide to live for myself. I am Ethel Eleanor McMullen, and finally, I was free.